It was supposed to be a quiet spring night in St. Louis, 1991. Two sisters, Julie and Robin Kerry, walked across the old Chain of Rocks Bridge with their cousin laughing and enjoying the view of the Mississippi River below. But what began as an evening adventure soon turned into a nightmare that would end in tragedy, scandal, and an execution 14 years later. On that same bridge, Marlin Andrew Gray and 3 friends were waiting. What followed was an attack so shocking that it would haunt Missouri for decades. The girls were assaulted. Their cousin Thomas Cummins was beaten and forced to the ground. And then, in an act of pure horror, Julie and Robin were pushed from the bridge into the dark, rushing water below. Cummins barely escaped with his life. The sisters never came back. Police quickly connected Gray and his accomplices to the crime. Gray, though he insisted he had not pushed the victims himself, was branded the ringleader, the man who set everything in motion. A jury agreed, sentencing him to death. His co-defendants received different fates, one life in prison, another death sentence reduced another, spared through cooperation. But for Gray, there would be no escape. For years, Gray fought his conviction, claiming innocence and pointing to a system that treated him more harshly than the others. Human rights groups rallied to his defense, arguing the evidence was thin. Yet the court stood firm. On October 26, 2005, Marlin Gray was executed by lethal injection. His final words were of peace and forgiveness, but his case still raises a haunting question. Was this justice, or the ultimate example of a punishment that did not fit the crime classification? Murderer characteristics, rape number of victims. Date of murders, April 4, 1991. Date of birth, September 26, 1907. Victims profile, Julie Kerry, 20, and her sister Robin Kerry, 19. Method of murder, pushing them off a bridge. Location, St. Louis, Missouri, USA. Status, executed by lethal injection in Missouri on October 26, 2005. 20-year-old Julie Kerry and her sister, 19-year-old Robin Kerry, made arrangements with their 19-year-old cousin, Thomas Cummins, to meet them shortly before midnight on April 4, 1991. The Kerry sisters were intent on showing Cummins a graffiti poem the girls had painted on the Chain of Rocks Bridge. The abandoned Chain of Rocks Bridge spans the Mississippi River at St. Louis and has been a site of drinking and partying by trespassers. Earlier that same evening, defendant Marlin Gray, Reginald Reggie Clemens, Antonio Tony Richardson, and Daniel Winfrey met at the home of a mutual friend. Defendant was the oldest and largest of the group. At defendant's suggestion, the 4 left for the Chain of Rocks Bridge to smoke a joint. The men confronted the Kerry sisters and Cummins at the bridge. Clemens ripped off Julie Kerry's clothing and raped her as she was held by Richardson. Julie and Robin were then raped by Clemens and Richardson. Defendant told Winfrey to watch Cummins. Then, with the assistance of Clemens, defendant tore off Robin Kerry's clothing and raped her. Clemens then forced Cummins to surrender his wallet, wristwatch, some cash, and keys. Clemens ordered Cummins and the Kerry sisters to step out onto the concrete pier below the metal platform. The 3 were told not to touch each other. Julie Kerry and then Robin were pushed from the pier of the bridge, falling a distance of 50 to 70 feet to the water. Cummins was then told to jump. Believing his chances of survival were better if he jumped instead of being pushed, he jumped from the bridge. The body of Robin Kerry was never recovered. Julie Kerry's body was found 3 weeks later in the Mississippi River. Cummins testified at trial. Daniel Winfrey, who was 15 at the time of the murders, is serving a 30-year sentence after pleading guilty to 9 charges, including 2 counts each of second-degree murder and forcible rape, and agreeing to testify against the other men. Reginald Clemens is on death row. The Missouri Supreme Court reduced Antonio Richardson's death sentence to life in prison because he was sentenced to death by a judge, not a jury, to final words. I go forward now on wings built by the love and support of my family and friends. I go with a peace of mind that comes from never having taken a human life. I forgive those who have hardened their hearts to the truth, and I pray they ask forgiveness, for they know not what they do. This is not a death, it is a lynching. The Chain of Rocks Bridge is a highway bridge over the Mississippi River that formerly permitted traffic to travel between Illinois and Missouri before authorities closed the bridge to vehicular traffic. Julie and Robin Kerry arranged to take their visiting cousin Thomas Cummins to the bridge to show him a graffiti poem they had painted there several years earlier. On April 4, 1991, at approximately 11:25 p.m., the 2 sisters and Cummins went to the bridge. Earlier that evening, Reginald Clemens, along with Marlin Gray, Daniel Winfrey, and Clemens' cousin Antonio Richardson, met at a mutual friend's home. They drank beer and smoked marijuana. Gray suggested that they go to the Chain of Rocks Bridge. About 11:00 p.m., Clemens, Richardson, Gray, and Winfrey drove in 2 separate cars to the bridge. Parking near the Missouri end of the bridge, the foursome went through a hole in the fence over a pile of rocks blocking the bridge entrance to vehicles and onto the bridge deck. They attempted to smoke a joint of marijuana but found the marijuana too wet to light. The group walked back toward their cars. They left behind a long metal flashlight that Richardson brought to the bridge. The Kerry sisters and Cummins arrived at the bridge sometime after Clemens and his friends. The Kerrys and Cummins made their way onto the bridge deck and walked toward the Illinois end of the bridge. They encountered Clemens and his companions who were headed back toward the Missouri side. The two groups briefly chatted. One of the Kerry sisters gave Winfrey a cigarette. Gary showed the Kerrys and Cummins how to climb over the bridge railing and come back up through a manhole in the bridge deck. He told Cummins that the manhole was a good place to be alone and take your woman. The two groups parted, heading in opposite directions. Cummins and the Kerry sisters stopped to look at the graffiti poem and then continued walking toward Illinois. In the meantime, Clemens and his friends had returned to the Missouri end of the bridge. As they lingered there, Clemens suggested to his companions, "Let's rob them." Gray replied, "Yeah, I feel like hurting somebody." Richardson suggested they rape the girls. Clemens agreed. The foursome walked back toward the Illinois end of the bridge. As they walked, Winfrey saw Gray talk to Clemens, after which Gray came to Winfrey and handed him a condom. Winfrey put the condom in his pocket and stated that he wasn't going to do it. Clemens grabbed Winfrey, pushed him toward the rail of the bridge, and threatened him until Winfrey agreed to do it. They caught up with the Kerry sisters and Cummins and ordered Cummins to lie on the ground. They raped the sisters and eventually ordered them into a manhole. On the metal platform under the bridge, Cummins laid down next to Julie and Robin Kerry. They were ordered to get up and go towards the concrete pier below the platform. Julie was pushed off first, then Robin. Cummins was ordered to jump. He did. When he surfaced after his 70-foot fall, he saw Julie nearby in the water and called for her to swim. Fighting the current and rough water, Julie grabbed Cummins, dragging them both below the surface. Cummins broke free. Julie did not reappear. Cummins eventually reached a steep riverbank and came ashore by a wooded area near the Chain of Rocks waterworks. Authorities recovered Julie's body from the river near Caruthersville, Missouri about 3 weeks later. Robin's body is still missing. Legal chronology. 1991. 04-05. Marlin Gray with co-defendants Antonio Richardson, Reginald Clemens and Daniel Winfrey rape and kill Julie and Robin Kerry by pushing them off the Chain of Rocks Bridge in St. Louis, Missouri. 06-21. Gray is charged by indictment with 2 counts of first-degree murder, as well as other felonies. 1992, 10-21. The jury returns a verdict of guilty on 2 counts of murder first degree. 10-23. The jury returns a death sentence as punishment on each count of first-degree murder. 12:03. The St. Louis City Circuit Court sentences Gary to death for both murder convictions. 1993-05-06. Gray files a motion for post-conviction relief in the Circuit Court of St. Louis City. 11:29. The Circuit Court denies post-conviction relief. 1994-10-25. The Missouri Supreme Court affirms Gray's conviction and sentence and the denial of post-conviction relief. State v. Gray 887 SW2D 369 Mobank 1994. 1995, 03-27. The United States Supreme Court denies certiorari review. Gray v. Missouri, 514 U.S. 1042, 1995. 04-25. Gray files a petition for writ of habeas corpus in the United States District Court for the Eastern District of Missouri. 2000-07-14. The District Court denies the petition of writ of habeas corpus in an unpublished order. 2002-02-26. The Court of Appeals affirms the denial of habeas relief. Gray v. Bowersox, 281 F3D 749 8th 2002. 2003-01-13. The Supreme Court declines discretionary review. Gray v. Lubbers, 537 U.S. 115. 2002. 06-24. The state requests the Missouri Supreme Court to set an execution date. 2005-09-26. The Missouri Supreme Court sets Gray's execution date of October 26, 2000, Tuesday, October 25, 2005. Bone tear. With a sheet covering him to his neck, Marlin Gray was executed by Missouri state employees early this morning for his role in the 1991 murders of 2 young women on the old Chain of Rocks Bridge. Gray died by injection at 12:07 a.m. Before the drugs were applied, he smiled and appeared to mouth the words, "I love you," at witnesses. As the first drug took effect, he either smiled or grimaced. Then he gasped and lay still. Prosecutors said Gray was the mastermind of the robbery and murder that claimed the lives of Julie and Robin Kerry, who were thrown off the bridge. Robin's body has never been found. Their cousin Tom Cummins was ordered to jump off the bridge, but he survived and testified at the trial of the 3 men and 1 teenager who were also on the bridge that night. Daniel Winfrey, who was 15 at the time of the murders, is serving a 30-year sentence after pleading guilty to 9 charges, including 2 counts each of second-degree murder and forcible rape, and agreeing to testify against the other men. Reginald Clemens is on death row. The Missouri Supreme Court reduced Antonio Richardson's death sentence to life in prison because he was sentenced to death by a judge, not a jury. After the U.S. Supreme Court turned down Gray's final appeals Tuesday night and Missouri Governor Matt Blunt denied clemency, one of Gray's lawyers issued a statement just before 6:30 p.m. "I continue to believe that he is innocent and that the imposition of the death penalty in his case is completely unjust and inappropriate." Joanne Martin Desher wrote, "I am deeply saddened over the outcome." Blunt had released a statement about an hour earlier. Missouri's highest courts and a jury of Marlin Gray's peers determined unequivocally that he should be held accountable for Julie and Robin Kerry's deaths, Blunt said. "I support the sentence issued and affirmed by both Missouri and U.S. courts and believe justice has been served. My thoughts and prayers are with family and friends who mourn the loss of Julie and Robin." In the days prior to the execution, Blunt received letters, emails, faxes, and phone calls opposing the execution from campaigns run by Amnesty International and Missourians to abolish the death penalty. A busload of Gray's supporters drove to Blunt's office Tuesday, and U.S. Representative William Lacey Clay Jr. D. St. Louis sent Blunt a letter Monday echoing those concerns. Blunt said in a statement following the execution, "Marlin Gray was found responsible for these deaths. The events of that night were heard before a jury and judges at every level, all of whom affirmed this just punishment. I carefully reviewed applications for clemency and the legal proceedings history, and found no cause to justify preempting previous judicial proceedings." Gray's advocates and opponents of the death penalty have argued that the 38-year-old was not on the bridge when Julie 20 and Robin 19 were pushed to their deaths. There were 67 opponents and 4 in favor of the death penalty outside the prison. At his 1992 trial, Gray told jurors that he left the bridge to smoke pot, and that Reginald Clemens told him, "Man, I just robbed that guy and threw the girls into the river," when he returned. In an interview Thursday, Gray said that when he returned to the bridge, Antonio Richardson said there had been an accident and the girls had fallen in the river. Gray's supporters have also argued that Nels Moss, who prosecuted Gray, withheld potentially exculpatory evidence and unfairly swayed the jury by comparing Gray to Charles Manson. In an email message to the Post-Dispatch on Tuesday, Moss took issue with Gray's version of events that night and the statements of his supporters. What Gray fails to say is he told his co-defendants that he felt like hurting someone that night and passed out condoms, according to Winfrey Moss wrote. Moss said Gray also shared the money taken from the Kerrys, and Cummins congratulated Richardson on his bravery and threatened to shoot Cummins if he resisted. Moss said an internal affairs investigation did not substantiate Gray's allegation of a police beating and that appellate courts have consistently failed to find misconduct in Gray's trial. The Missouri Supreme Court, in its opinion, found that the jury had ample evidence to believe that Marlin Gray aided, encouraged, and assisted in these rapes, robberies, assault, and murders, Moss wrote. Gray is the 66th man to be executed by injection in Missouri since the state resumed carrying out the death penalty in 1989. Missouri Department of Corrections spokesman John Fugger said, "Gray declined a last meal and a sedative. He had told officials that no one would be present as a witness on his behalf, but it appeared that he had witnesses. The witnesses on behalf of Gray were a female cousin and her minister. Fugger declined to name either one. The only victim's witness was Kevin Cummins, who is the girl's uncle, according to Fugger. In an interview Thursday, Gray said, "This is murder to me. I will not participate or let my family participate." Fugger said Gray was extremely calm and relaxed the whole day. In his final statement, Gray said, "I go forward now on wings built by the love and support of my family and friends. I go with a peace of mind that comes from never having taken a human life. I forgive those who have hardened their hearts to the truth, and I pray they ask forgiveness, for they know not what they do. This is not a death, it is a lynching." The Missouri Supreme Court has set an October 26 execution date for Marlin Gray, one of 4 convicted for the April 1991 murder of 2 sisters on the Chain of Rocks Bridge in St. Louis. The Office of Attorney General Jay Nixon represented the state against Gray's appeals. On the night of April 4, 1991, Gray and 3 companions, Reginald Clemens, Daniel Winfrey, and Antonio Richardson, encountered the 2 sisters Julie and Robin Kerry and their cousin Thomas Cummins. The 2 groups chatted briefly, then parted. After a few minutes, Gray and his group returned and sexually assaulted the sisters. The sisters and their cousin were pushed off the bridge. Cummins survived the 70-foot fall and swam ashore. Julie's body was recovered in Caruthersville 3 weeks later. Robin's body was never found. The brutal murder of these 2 sisters shocked the community and the sensibilities of all decent Missourians, Nixon said. A jury determined that the death penalty was appropriate in this case, and it is our duty to see that the sentence is carried out. A St. Louis Circuit Court jury found Gray guilty of 2 counts of first-degree murder and imposed 2 death sentences on December 9, 1992. Winfrey, who was 15 at the time, received a 30-year sentence. Cummins was sentenced to death on April 9, 1993 and remains on death row awaiting execution. Richardson, who was also sentenced to death, had his sentence overturned on appeal to life in prison. Update. Marlin Gray, convicted of 2 counts of first-degree murder as an accomplice to the killings of 2 sisters in April 1991, was executed early Wednesday. Gray lifted his head off a gurney just before the first of 3 drugs was injected into his body and mouthed words to a few witnesses, then fell silent. He previously had said he didn't want any family members or friends to witness the execution. He was pronounced dead at 12:07 a.m. Gray, 38, maintained his innocence in the deaths of sisters Julie and Robin Kerry on an abandoned Mississippi River bridge in St. Louis on April 4, 1991. He was convicted in 1992. Late Tuesday, the U.S. Supreme Court and Missouri Governor Matt Blunt turned back appeals for Gray within minutes of each other. Gray's attorney Joanne Desher said she had received a call from the Supreme Court denying her motion to stay the execution and another request to review the entire case. "It's all been denied," she said. Blunt issued a statement saying he had denied the clemency request and said the Board of Probation and Parole had recommended clemency be denied. He said he carefully reviewed the case and found no reason to set aside earlier judicial decisions. "I support the sentence issued and affirmed by both Missouri and U.S. courts and believe justice has been served," he said in a statement. The Kerry sisters, Julie and Robin, were raped and pushed from the old Chain of Rocks bridge the night they brought their 19-year-old cousin Thomas Cummins, visiting from Maryland, to the youth hangout. Gray said that he, his friend Reginald Clemens, and their acquaintances Antonio Richardson and Daniel Winfrey encountered the 3 cousins that night on the bridge and talked for a while. He claimed they left the bridge, but Richardson went back alone to retrieve a lost flashlight. When Richardson returned, he reported he'd seen Cummins acting frantic on the bridge, the sisters in the river, and spoke of an accident. Frightened, the 4 left. Nels Moss, who prosecuted the case, said, "Gray never did not present this version of the events at trial." He called Gray a sociopath who was unable to accept responsibility. Marlin A. Gray, September 29, 1967, October 26, 2005, was convicted of murder and executed by the U.S. state of Missouri by lethal injection. His conviction was for being part of a group of 4 men who on April 4, 1991, sexually assaulted and then murdered 2 sisters and attempted to murder the sister's cousin on the Chain of Rocks bridge over the Mississippi River in St. Louis, Missouri. Gray continued to protest his innocence, saying that although he was at the bridge at the time, he was smoking cannabis in a nearby car. On December 9, 1992, Gray was convicted of 2 counts of first-degree murder and was executed by lethal injection on October 26, 2005. He maintained his innocence to the end, although police showed on audio and videotape that he had recounted the entire event to them, admitting his part in the murders. The events of April 4, 1991. On the night of April 4, 20-year-old Julie Kerry, 19-year-old Robin Kerry, and their 19-year-old cousin Thomas Cummins were on the Chain of Rocks bridge over the Mississippi River. Gray, Antonio Richardson, Reginald Clemens, and Daniel Winfrey went to the bridge that night together. The 2 groups who did not know each other had a brief conversation. Gray showed the other group how to climb down a manhole cover on the bridge down to the pier. Then the 2 groups separated. The prosecution's allegations. According to testimony offered on behalf of the prosecution, several minutes later, the group of 4 men decided to rob the 3, with Winfrey testifying that Gray said he felt like hurting somebody. They returned and Gray told Cummins that, "This is a robbery, get down on the ground." The 2 girls were grabbed and held on the ground. Richardson held Julie down while Clemens raped her, and then the 2 swapped position. Gray and Clemens then took turns to rape Robin and Julie. Cummins was then robbed of his wallet, wristwatch, cash, and keys, and the 3 victims were forced down the manhole cover to the concrete pier. The 2 Kerrys then were pushed, and Cummins jumped as instructed. Medical witnesses testified that Cummins and Julie Kerry survived the 70 feet 21 millimeter fall to the water below. Cummins testified that after surfacing, the current pulled him over to Julie, but then she drifted off after he began to drown. Cummins swam to shore and survived. The body of Julie Kerry was found 3 weeks later, near Caruthersville, Missouri, and the body of Robin Kerry never has been found. When apprehended by police, Gray had Cummins' engraved watch in his possession. Clemens had Cummins' firefighter's badge, and Richardson had left his fingerprints on Cummins' driver license. Gray's version of the events. The version of events, according to Gray, is very different and changed each time he presented it. In an interview in 2005, he said that after parting from the group of 3, Gray went to a car where he smoked marijuana, while Richardson went to retrieve a flashlight stolen by Richardson from a police officer's residence he had left on the bridge. Gray returned to the bridge 30 minutes later to find that the girls and their cousin were gone. Richardson said that Cummins had said the girls had slipped off the bridge but thought the authorities would not believe this story. Cummins was then robbed by the men of his belongings. The version given by Gray at his trial was different and also differs from what police said that he told them in his initial interview. On returning after 30 minutes in the car, Clemens informed him that, "Man, I just robbed that guy and threw him and the girls into the river." Gray's mother testified that he was at home all night and never left their residence. Defense claims both Gray and Cummins, who was initially a suspect, have said that they were physically abused during their interrogations. In the case of Cummins, he eventually would receive a $150,000 settlement from the city of St. Louis. Gray said that he confessed during the interrogations to raping the two girls in order that police stop beating him. Gray's defense lawyers also argued that the prosecutor Nels Moss had made allusions to Charles Manson when he described Gray's character witnesses as similar to followers of Charles Manson. Moss also did not disclose the settlement with Cummins to the defense. They also argued that it was inappropriate for the prosecutor to tell the jury that theirs was not the final word in the case. Gray's father claims that the conviction and sentence were racially motivated. Trial and appeals. Winfrey, who was 15 years old at the time, confessed to the murder in the presence of police and his parents. He pleaded guilty to second-degree murder and forcible rape and testified against the other three in their trials. He currently is serving a 30-year sentence. He testified that Clemens and Richardson were the ones who had pushed the two girls. Winfrey will receive parole in the summer of 2007. By the time he is released, he will have served 15 years. For his part, Clemens was sentenced to death and still is on death row. Richardson was also given a death sentence but had his sentence commuted to life in prison by the Supreme Court of Missouri on October 28, 2003, which cited his sentencing by a judge rather than a jury in violation of Apprendi v. New Jersey. Richardson had been the focus of strenuous efforts by death penalty opponents due to his mental deficiencies, an IQ of 75 while mental retardation is classified as an IQ of 40 or less, and youth at the time of the murders, even though his own psychologist and his mother testified that he knows the difference between right and wrong. In 2005, the Supreme Court of the United States ruled that executions of persons who committed their crimes as juveniles were unconstitutional. Gray's execution date was set by the Missouri Supreme Court on September 26, 2005. Governor Matt Blunt denied Gray clemency on October 25th after a recommendation by the Missouri Board of Probation and Parole not to do so. That same day, the Supreme Court of the United States denied his motions to stay his execution. Gray asked that no member of his family witness the execution, which he described as murder, although a female cousin and a minister were present. The only witness for the victims present at the execution was Kevin Cummins, the uncle of the two girls. Gray also made no last meal request and gave no instructions for the disposal of his body. His final statement, "I go forward now on wings built by the love and support of my family and friends. I go with a peace of mind that comes from never having taken a human life. I forgive those who have hardened their hearts to the truth, and I pray they ask forgiveness, for they know not what they do. This is not a death, it is a lynching." October 26, 2005. Marlin Gray, a black man, faces execution in Missouri on October 26, 2005 for the deaths of Julie and Robin Kerry in St. Louis. On April 4, 1991, the Kerry sisters took their cousin, Thomas Cummins, to the nearby Chain of Rocks Bridge. While on the bridge, the three cousins met Marlin Gray, Reginald Clemens, Daniel Winfrey, and Antonio Richardson. The two girls were reportedly raped and then pushed off the bridge. Cummins was then reportedly told to jump, which he did. Marlin Gray was 23 years old at the time of the murders and had never been convicted of a felony before. There are many questionable circumstances regarding the events of that night and Gray's sentence. One of the more disturbing facts about Gray's case regards his interrogation. From the beginning, Gray has consistently held that he was physically abused during police interrogation. Thomas Cummins also maintained that he was beat during interrogation. Cummins received a settlement of $150,000. Gray's accusations were disregarded. However, both men's stories of abuse were similar. Why did the system believe one man and not the other? Another major problem with Gray's case is that the prosecuting attorney did not at first disclose the evidence of Cummins' settlement. The prosecution also made inappropriate allusions to the Manson murders and suggested ways in which Gray was similar to Charles Manson. The effect that such inappropriate comments can have on a jury is clear. The prosecutor used this language in Gray and Clemens' cases, and both men received death sentences. He did not use allusions to Charles Manson in Richardson's first trial, which led to a hung jury. The prosecuting attorney also erred when he assured the jury that theirs was not the final word in the case, alluding to the appeals process. Such statements may give jurors false confidence that they will not be responsible if they wrongly sentence the defendant. Finally, much of Gray's conviction was based on the testimony of Gray's co-defendants. Clearly, such testimony is not reliable. This is not guilt beyond a reasonable doubt, and yet Gray has been sentenced to death. Marlin Gray was 23 years old at the time of the crime, which was his only felony conviction. He has never had a problem with violence during his 12 years on death row, and he has steadily remained employed during his many years in prison. Gray's case is too fraught with procedural issues and doubts. Death penalty is not an appropriate punishment. Please write to Governor Matt Blunt requesting that he commute Gray's death sentence. October 26, 2005. Marlin Gray, 38, was put to death at the Eastern Reception Diagnostic and Correctional Center in Bonne Terre. He died by lethal injection shortly after midnight today. Governor Matt Blunt denied a grant for clemency, and the U.S. Supreme Court rejected the appeal filed on Gray's behalf. He was the fifth person executed in Missouri this year. Gray was put to death for his role in the murders of sisters Julie and Robin Kerry. In 1991, he and three other young men, Reginald Clemens, Daniel Winfrey, and Antonio Richardson, met the sisters and their cousin Thomas Cummins on the Chain of Rocks Bridge in St. Louis. Afterward, Gray, Richardson, and Clemens raped the girls and later pushed them off the bridge into the Mississippi River. Gray was convicted of 2 counts of first-degree murder as an accomplice. Eugene Cummins, father of Cummins and uncle of the deceased sisters, said Wednesday that Gray's execution would not affect him because his family was already at peace. I don't mean to sound callous or uncaring, but Marlin Gray, for example, is to be executed tonight, and he has made his own bed and he must lie in it, he said. What he did hurt my family years ago, but he no longer has the power to hurt my family. Gray, who maintained his innocence until the end, had urged people to intervene on his behalf. If you don't get involved, the state will execute an innocent man, he said. Gray's supporters were in Jefferson City on Tuesday afternoon to protest his death sentence. About 50 members of the St. Peter AME Church from St. Louis, Gray's home church, along with members of Missourians to abolish the death penalty, met in the rotunda of the Capitol building for a service praying for Gray. The group held their meeting just under Blunt's office and called for the governor to stay the execution. Anti-death penalty advocates held signs, one of which read, "Execution is not the solution." Ed Doss and the Reverend Mark Williams, Gray's father and brother, came with the group to protest the execution. Williams, an associate pastor at the church, said Gray had 2 appeals pending at the U.S. Supreme Court. Williams said the family did not plan to be present for the execution. Asked what he planned to do instead, Williams said, pray. MADP and other Gray supporters also held vigils around the state in Springfield, St. Louis, Jefferson City, Cape, Girardeau, and Columbia. In Columbia, supporters met at the Boone County Courthouse on Wednesday evening, followed by a chapel service at the Newman Center. A candlelight vigil was also held outside the prison just before Gray was executed. October 26, 2005. St. Louis, Missouri, Reuters. A Missouri man who killed 2 women by pushing them off a bridge spanning the Mississippi River was put to death early Wednesday, a Missouri prison official said. Marlin Gray, 38, died at 12:07 a.m. CDT after workers at the Eastern Reception, Diagnostic and Correctional Center in Bonne Terre, Missouri, injected him with a series of lethal drugs, stopping his heart. Gray was convicted and sentenced to death for his role in the April 1991 rapes and murders of 2 young women who Gray and his friends encountered by chance after a night spent drinking and smoking marijuana. In his final statement, Gray denied having committed the murders. I go with the peace of mind of never having taken a human life, Gray said. This is not a death, it is a lynching. The women Julie Kerry and her sister Robin Kerry were showing a cousin a poem they had written on a bridge which spans the Mississippi River between Missouri and Illinois when they ran into Gray and his 3 friends shortly before midnight. The men raped the sisters, then pushed them off the bridge. A fall of about 70 feet, officials said. Julie Kerry's body was later found, but Robin Kerry's body was never located. The cousin Thomas Cummins survived the fall. One of Gray's accomplices, Reginald Clemens, is on death row awaiting execution. Another accomplice, Antonio Richardson, was sentenced to death but had his sentence commuted 2 years ago to life without parole. A 4th accomplice, Daniel Winfrey, avoided the death penalty through a plea agreement. Gray was the 66th inmate executed in Missouri since the death penalty was reinstated in October 25, 2005. St. Louis. Within minutes of each other late Tuesday, the U.S. Supreme Court and Missouri Governor Matt Blunt turned back appeals for convicted murderer Marlin Gray, freeing the state to execute him by injection at 12:01 a.m. Wednesday. Gray's attorney Joanne Desher said she had received a call from the Supreme Court denying her motion to stay the execution and another request to review the entire case. It's all been denied, she said. Blunt issued a statement saying he had denied the clemency request and said the Board of Probation and Parole had recommended clemency be denied. He said he carefully reviewed the case and found no reason to set aside earlier judicial decisions. I support the sentence issued and affirmed by both Missouri and U.S. courts and believe justice has been served, he said in a statement. Gray, 38, maintained his innocence in the deaths of sisters Julie and Robin Kerry on an abandoned Mississippi River bridge in St. Louis in April 1991. He was convicted in 1992 of 2 counts of first-degree murder as an accomplice. Gray's lawyers argued the state didn't present sufficient evidence to convict him of first-degree murder, failing to show he participated in the crimes or planned and directed them. The state conceded Gray was not on the bridge when the women died. The appeal also alleged Gray's confession was coerced by police prosecutorial misconduct and withholding of evidence. On Monday, Representative William Lacey Claydemo wrote Blunt imploring him to prevent another wrongful execution in Missouri, citing Larry Griffin, executed in 1995, whose case was reopened earlier this year. He said the appeal raises serious doubts that the case was handled fairly. Amnesty International also urged Blunt to grant clemency. The state maintained that the Kerry sisters, Julie, 21, and Robin, 19 of North St. Louis County, were raped and pushed from the old Chain of Rocks bridge the night they brought their 19-year-old cousin Thomas Cummins, visiting from Maryland, to the youth hangout. Gray told the Associated Press that he friend Reginald Clemens and acquaintances Antonio Richardson and Daniel Winfrey encountered the 3 that night on the bridge and talked for a while. They left the bridge, but Richardson went back to retrieve a lost flashlight. When Richardson returned, he reported he'd seen Cummins frantic on the bridge and the sisters in the river and spoke of an accident. Frightened, the 4 left. Nels Moss, who prosecuted the case, said, Gray never stated that at trial. Cummins, originally a key suspect, was never prosecuted, although police reports indicate he changed his story several times and failed a lie detector test. He initially told police Julie lost her balance when he reached out to her on the railing and fell into the river, and that Robin had jumped in to save her. Cummins became a chief witness in the others' murder trials, later settling for $150,000 over claims police abused him during interrogation. Gray also maintained St. Louis police had coerced his confession with beatings and threats and refused requests for a lawyer. Moss said Cummins later denied the oral statement implicating himself and made a taped statement corroborating that of Winfrey, who testified against the others. Moss rebuffed accusations of prosecutorial misconduct, saying the courts never found that to be true. He called Gray a sociopath who was unable to accept responsibility. St. Louis M.O. The Organization for Black Struggle affiliate of the Black Radical Congress is making an urgent plea to all justice-seeking friends to stop the state murder of Marlin Gray. Gray has an execution date of Wednesday, October 26 at 12:01 a.m. The recent discovery of the 1995 execution of Larry Griffin is hovering over us as a grim reminder of what can happen. We must mount a mammoth offensive before another innocent black man is murdered in Missouri. Marlin Gray's case may be another example of being at the wrong place at the wrong time. In 1991, Gray and 3 teenagers visited a well-known hangout called Chain of Rocks Bridge. They encountered Julie and Robin Kerry and their out-of-town cousin Tom Cummins, all white. Before the dawn, Julie and Robin end up in the Mississippi River. Julie's body was never recovered. Cummins was the original suspect and was arrested and charged with the murders. His story had conflicting and incredulous facts, like alleged jumping 80 feet into the cold water and swimming against the mighty currents in attempts to save his cousin. When found by the Coast Guard, Cummins' hair was completely dry and contained no river silt. He also failed a polygraph test. Another scenario pieced together based on documents is that Cummins had a romantic thing for Julie. As she was sitting on the bridge guardrail, Cummins made an advance towards her, perhaps a kiss. She leaned backward to avoid him and fell into the water. Her sister jumped in to try and save her. Guilt shifted from Cummins when it was discovered that Gray and others were also on the bridge that fateful night. In short order, the sole white member of their group was used to turn state's evidence against the 3 young black men. Charges were then dropped against Cummins, who eventually sued the St. Louis Police Department and walked away with $150,000. The black youth all received the death penalty in one of the most high-publicized murder cases of the 1990s. If we can stop Pepsi-Cola from canceling Kanye West's contract, surely we can halt the lethal execution of a black man who has proclaimed his innocence from the start. No physical evidence, beaten confessions by police prosecutorial misconduct, deals cut in exchange for false testimony, all have been ignored at this point by the racist judicial system. The only way to get justice for Marlin Gray co-defendant Reginald Clemens and the Kerry family is to get to the real truth. The only way to stop the execution is to put pressure on Missouri's governor. And so, the story of Marlin Andrew Gray ends not on the old Chain of Rocks Bridge, but in a sterile execution chamber in Missouri. 14 years separated the night of horror in 91 and the night in 2005 when the state carried out his sentence. 14 years of appeals, arguments, and pleas for mercy. 14 years of questions that never fully found answers. Julie and Robin Kerry lost their lives in the cold waters of the Mississippi River, and their family endured a grief that words can never capture. For them, Gray's execution was the closing of a chapter that began with unspeakable violence. But for others, that final act of punishment felt less like closure and more like another tragedy, a life taken while doubt still lingered about Gray's exact role. He was not accused of pushing the sisters into the river himself, yet he was branded the leader, the one who set everything in motion. His accomplices lived serving time behind bars. He alone was chosen to die. Was that justice, or was it the system's way of finding a single face to carry the full weight of the crime? On October 26, 2005, Marlin Gray spoke his last words calm, almost defiant about peace, forgiveness, and faith. Then, as the lethal drugs took hold, his life ended. For some, it was the justice they had waited for. For others, it was proof of a justice system too quick to condemn, too blind to nuance, too eager for an irreversible solution. In the end, the Chain of Rocks Bridge remains a chilling reminder of 2 young lives lost, of a community scarred, and of a punishment that continues to divide. Justice was delivered, but whether it was fair will always remain in question.